Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Deanna Minich. Welcome to another one of the American Nutrition Association's Thought Leader Conversation series that we've been having with a variety of different experts. The expert that we have today is going to be addressing some very pertinent issues as it relates to our food systems. And in fact, if you haven't seen the article that Michael Pollan just put out, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, please be sure to find it. Maybe we can even put it on this thread, because it really does address the breakdown in our food systems, our food ecosystem. So Dr. Selena Ahmed is an associate professor of sustainable food systems at Montana State University. She is an ethnobotanist with research and outreach interests at the intersection of the ecological, cultural, and health aspects of food systems. I just love that. The ultimate translational goal of her collaborative research program is to transform the food system through evidence-based innovations that support both human and planetary health. Welcome, Dr. Ahmed. So glad to have you here as part of this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Minich. Wonderful to be here. I've been thinking a lot about the food system and how it's being impacted right now. So really happy to have this dialogue with you.
Oh, it's just going to be fantastic. I mean, this is what so many of us at the ANA, so many of the CNSs are it's very much top of mind. So maybe you've been thinking about this. We've been in this lockdown for several weeks now. What are some of your general thoughts? What has been percolating up for you throughout the course of this time frame?
Yeah, absolutely. So two thoughts really came to mind initially as the pandemic, or really the outbreak, started happening in Asia and then moving across the world. And the central kind of question has been in my mind, what are sort of the social and ecological determinants that will enable food systems to be resilient during this? And that sort of played out in my mind in two different ways. And so one is based on the research that I've been carrying out for about the past 15 years in China. And so already back in January, as I was, learning about this outbreak, I was thinking about how is this going to be impacting the smallholder communities that I've been working with in China, for over a decade, almost 15 years. And then sort of thinking beyond that, how is that going to impact our global food system and our food systems here locally and nationally? And so one thing that really was strong in my mind was how the impacts are really going to differ based on our relationship with the food system. It's really going to vary depending on where we are, how we are procuring our food, including how we're growing our food. And so back in February, I was getting, photographs of local food environments from my collaborators in urban areas in China. And these are pictures that have now become very familiar to us of, supermarket aisles that are empty or have like reduced food supply. And then at the same time, I was getting images from the smallholder farming communities that I've been working with, and they were showing their tables, full of food with high dietary diversity. And working in those communities, I know that they've, most of their food comes from their surroundings. And so when we talk about a local diet, these communities really follow a super local diet where most of the food is coming, within 10-mile radius, or I would say even 5-mile radius from their homes. And so it was interesting to see that, on the one hand, while we're seeing urban consumers and, higher socioeconomic households really finding this difficulty in food access. At the same time, I was seeing these subsistence farming communities actually showing diets that really looked like they weren't being impacted as much by the pandemic. And so I really began to start thinking about our relationship to food and how we're procuring it. And then within farming communities also, I started thinking about these differences in terms of the food system resilience. And on the one hand, there's these communities that I work in that really follow these agroecological farming practices, these diversified, regenerative farming practices, where they really try to mimic a natural ecosystem and sort of managing the agro ecosystem. So lots of diversity at the genetic level, the landscape level, in order to sort of provide ecosystem services and without the need for all of this external input in terms of fertilizers and pesticides. And then there were the other farming communities that I work in, and they have long sort of moved to a more monoculture or intensified farming system. And in those communities, they're very reliant on labor coming from outside, as well as the purchase of external fertilizers and pesticides to really manage their supply and their yields. And so I already began to see small differences in these communities. And so that's something that I've been working with collaborators to sort of survey over the past few months, is sort of what are these elements of socio-ecological determinants that enable resilience in the food system. And at the same time, this past semester, our academic semester here at Montana State University just ended last week. And over the course of the semester, I teach a course on food system resilience. And so the concepts of this class, which for many students have seemed very conceptual and abstract, really began to play out, firsthand as we're sort of studying the theories of food system resilience. And so in January, February, and early March, we had just sort of finished this unit of these sort of abstract concepts of thinking about these different models of resilience. And there are these visual models. One's this ball and basin model of this ball that represents the food system that kind of stays in this basin, and then it kind of jumps into a different basin based on some sort of crisis or transformation. And then this other model is this adaptive cycle where basically systems transition and then they sort of go through collapse or crises and they re-transform. And so in all these different sectors of the food system, we've sort of began to see these sort of conceptual models of food system resilience play out. And so sort of at the core of what I've been thinking about and working with collaborators to think about and community members to think about are, how can we enhance the resilience of food systems in the context of this pandemic, but then in general, other shocks that are still impacting our food system. So climate change risks are still, going on. We still have market uncertainty. And so how are all of these different shocks coming together, and how can we really create more resilient and sustainable food systems?
Dr. Ahmed, that was beautiful. That was really a global, expansive view, zooming many layers out for all of us to hear in terms of the research that you're doing, the concerns that you have. And I'm wondering, so, your breadth of knowledge in this is vast. We can tell, you teach on this, and this sounds like it's even more than you teaching, it's a passion of yours. And I'm wondering, for all of us as nutrition professionals and interested people, take us down to the micro now. So in our everyday, let's say we live in a rural area or we live in an urban area, metropolis, like New York City, Chicago. What are some of the basic things that we can be attentive to? How can we walk through this pandemic with eyes of learning and wisdom that can be gleaned from your knowledge, so that when this comes up again, and I don't think COVID-19 and this whole pandemic is going away anytime soon. So it seems like we already need to start to make a shift. But what can we as an individual do within this milieu that we're currently in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I'm going to sort of back up first, thinking about what I think is the most pressing issue right now to address, and then how everybody can sort of think about addressing that in their own ways. And so I think, the non-negotiable goal of a food system, whether it's local or global or national, whatever scale, the non-negotiable goal of a food system is to provide food security. So nutritious, healthy, adequate, delicious food that meets cultural preferences for all people based on their lifestyle. And, so that's sort of the non-negotiable goal of food systems. And at the same time, we need to work towards achieving that despite all of the lockdowns and, despite our attempts to curtail the virus. And so there's critical food and agricultural workforce that don't necessarily have the opportunity to engage in those same social distancing and quarantine and lockdown measures, because food still needs to supply to ensure local and national and global food security. And so right now, I think one of the most critical impacts on the food system is, and what we should all really be thinking about, is how can we ensure the welfare and well-being and equity of food system workers. So that's the farmers, that's the food distributors, those are the grocery store workers that are eventually helping bring nutritious food to our tables so we can make those dietary decisions, to eat a balanced diet so we can have a strong immune system. And so right now, for me, I think the most critical thing really to focus on is, how can we as individuals somehow support making sure that the food and agricultural workforce is sustainable and is safe. And I think this looks different depending on where all of us are. And so, there's been this upsurge, let's say, in a lot of local food system activities, which I think is a really promising product of this pandemic. And so I've been hearing and seeing some preliminary data how there's a surge in memberships for community-supported agriculture. So helping ensure, our local farms and our local farmers are functioning and able to provide overall food security. And then for me, for example, the way I have been trying to support the welfare of food and agricultural workers is really thinking about how can we sort of design plans and risk management to educate consumers as well as food and agricultural workforce on how to practice best farm and food safety and workplace practices so when we're going into the grocery store or when we're going to pick up food, let's say from a CSA, that we are not transferring or transmitting the virus and putting farmers and the food and agricultural workforce at risk. And so there's a lot of, I think, education on sort of food safety that is really important for the consumer to understand, and making sure that our farm workers and food distributors and food handlers really are safe during this time. And so another project that I've been working on during this time, and this is sort of where most of my energy has been in the past 2.5 months, is working with a group of collaborators to really see how we can meet the testing needs to ensure that the food system workforce is being tested for the virus, and so we can sort of identify where there might be hotspots of outbreaks within the food system, and then really implement measures very specifically to support that. And so I think, as individuals, that education in thinking about our workforce within the food system is really critical at that time. And I think it looks different depending on where you are. And so in many ways, it is about supporting a local food system, but making sure in those local food systems, such as a CSA, that there are sort of best practices that are happening. So whether you're going to the grocery store, picking up a CSA share, that everybody is doing their part to ensure food safety.
Okay, good. So I'm hearing stay local, support community-based agriculture and farmers. You mentioned a number of times already this issue of food safety. And I've been hearing different things about SARS-CoV-2 in terms of its transmission through food. In fact, there was even a very popular YouTube video in which a medical doctor in Michigan did this whole display of how to sanitize your food when you come home from the grocery store. And I think as nutrition professionals, we need to know, what is the risk? What is the risk if you go to a grocery store and you buy packaged goods? Does SARS-CoV-2 have different longevity on a can, a package, cardboard, a slick syrup? Do we even know this? I don't even think that we have that idea, do we?
You're absolutely right. Yeah. So there's that is something that is such an unknown right now. There's very little evidence on that. Right now, I'm writing a proposal actually to study that very question on, how does the virus transfer from, one surface to another surface. And so we know that there is sort of the virus is able to, let's say, stay on cardboard. There's some preliminary evidence. Some studies say 24 hours, some studies say 48 hours. But what is the survivability of that virus and its transfer? So yeah, that, so another thing that I think this outbreak really points to is the need for, evidence-based solutions in thinking through all of that. Absolutely. But also sort of going back, when I'm talking about food safety, I'm sort of talking about sort of the workforce safety. And so already, we're beginning to see that there's these hot spots of the virus outbreaking in different sectors of the food system. And so more regionally where I live, we've seen, meat processing factories in South Dakota being hotspots of the virus, where slaughterhouse workers really have to be standing kind of shoulder to shoulder with each other, during that processing. And so some of the biggest outbreaks that are actually happening in South Dakota are within, the food system, within these processing plants. Likewise, in Iowa, within hog factories that are processing, there's also been outbreaks within the workforce. And so when I'm thinking about food safety, I'm sort of thinking about the workforce food safety as well, the transmission from worker to worker. Yes. And likewise, in the grocery store workers have also been at higher risk.
Okay, so that's good to know. And so I think it's appropriate. When I think of going to the grocery store, I mask up. And I know that some grocery stores are really good about guidelines, about shopping times. There's a person standing, sanitizing the carts, offering masks. And so, and even within the grocery store itself, you can see that there are directional arrows pointing you in the direction of the flow of the aisles. And so, and the plexiglass, of course, that has gone up. That was weeks ago. I've seen that in multiple grocery stores. So I feel like these stores are taking good care of the people in the ways that they can and the ways that we know. I do want to ask you about what I'm seeing repeatedly coming up in the media, and that is animal food production. So, and the ANA is not dogmatic in the way of saying we need to eat a certain way. So there's no allegiance here to eating a certain way. And I'm very strong in that mindset of that nutrition needs to be personalized. That said, what we are seeing and some people are questioning is there increased contamination that we are seeing through animal products of various types? You had mentioned these two outbreaks based on these hotspots. I was reading about the one, I believe it was in one of the Carolinas. It just seems like these are happening with some repetition. So what do we need to be thinking about as it relates to animal-based products if we have those in our diet during
that's a really great question. And I think it's not so much the animal product itself, it's the way that it's farmed. And so it's not so much necessarily, if there is a sustainable production, that's kind of following these best agricultural practices, these restorative agricultural practices, and consumers are buying that well-sourced, meat. It's not so much necessarily, I think, the actual consumption, because there are some agricultural practices for raising meat, that can support conservation, that can support planetary health. In many ways, it's much more the way of our industrialized food system of really producing meat. I think those vulnerabilities just have been highlighted so much during this time, and there've really been breakdowns in those specific systems. And I think it's really shedding light that we really do need to transition into these more sustainable ways of producing meat and the amount of meat that is produced. And so, in thinking about plant-based diets, I think there's such a good opportunity, not necessarily to be, promoting a vegetarian diet because, again, personalized nutrition really resonates with me. But in terms of thinking about a more sustainable diet, I think, thinking about alternative ways of getting our protein is really, really important at this time, because a lot of the agricultural practices that support sustainability are also those that can support resilience during this time of shock. And so some of the basic things that when we were thinking about sort of supporting ecological sustainability within a farm, those are also things that have scientifically been shown to support the ability of the farm to absorb shocks. And some preliminary interviews that we're doing also are showing, those are shocks to the current pandemic right now as well. And so thinking about like diversified restorative agriculture being one of those practices. And so in terms of plant-based diets, or plant-based protein versus meat consumption, I think really there's this huge need to really start thinking about the way we're producing our food now. I think it's being highlighted really on this global scale, and so it's something that a lot of people have been talking about, and I think this pandemic has really shown the ability of society to be decisive, right? And so a lot of times we think change comes after a long time, but I think this pandemic, we've seen that society is really able to mobilize and make change very rapidly. And so in many ways, I think this can be an opportunity for thinking about more sustainable food systems and how we can transition towards them.
It's so interesting because just like you said, I feel like this pandemic has been a catalyst to so many different things, for people to really be thinking about their health. And now we're talking about thinking about our food, and not just eating good quality food to the degree that we can, but really asking the questions of, where did that food come from? How was it procured? How was the animal raised? So can you give us just a short list of maybe, I think as the average consumer and even a nutrition professional, we have to go and actually do research on our food. Kind of crazy, but we need to do it in order to be better informed. So if we go to different farms and we are exploring wild caught fish, pasture fed chickens and eggs, and meats and such, what are the questions that we need to be asking the farms? Like, what are the top 3 things that we need to be looking for at the grocery store, so that, of course, like you said, go local, get to know your farmer. I used to live in a neighborhood where I actually knew the farmer, and it was great. I've since moved out of that neighborhood, and not everybody has access to a farmer. So if we're online and we're doing shopping, or even we're looking at brands in a grocery store, what are the questions that we need to ask?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, some of those key tenets of sustainability for sustainable food systems, are still very important right now. And so obviously, I think for a lot of people don't have the ability or the privilege to make certain decisions. But as we are able to make certain decisions, I think, we should be able to be thinking about, can we support, local foods, right? So what are the local options that we can support at this time? Thinking about, what are the options that support planetary health? And there's no sort of certification to indicate that. And so a lot of times as a proxy measure, we think about, supporting foods that follow organic practices. However, those are not necessarily, the ideal growing practices, because there's a lot of agricultural practices that farms may not actually be organically certified, but follow practices that are, really good for planetary health beyond organic certification. But in the context of limited information, supporting organic can really be helpful. And then if you have the ability to, if you have access to local farmers or have information about that, the questions, that I really like to ask is, understanding what farms are, what farmers are growing on their farm. And so that's just like a really basic question. But then when you begin to sort of understand the diversity of what's grown versus one crop, or like 5 crops, right? And so there's some farms within the valley where I live where, some farms have, 90 to 100 different food plants that they're growing versus others that might just have a field of 1 or 2 crops. And so I think the more diversified the farm is, and a lot of times, that can support resilience and sustainability in many different ways. So just kind of learning, about what's being grown, and then learning about the farming practices. And so, asking if the production practices are organic. They might actually be following practices that are beyond organic certification, but there actually isn't organic certification. So just sort of learning about, the inputs that farmers are using. Are they using pesticides? Are they using herbicides? What kind of fertilizers are they using? So those are sort of like the 4 key things that I, try to understand when I'm speaking with local farmers. And I think, more and more, I think producers are also recognizing the need for consumers to know this information. And so where it's possible, more and more I'm seeing this information is available, whether it's on a farm website or some sort of brochure that's given to consumers. And so, and that there's more and more need for that education to continue to happen.
Is there a good site where professionals can go to get this type of information, like a good organizational nonprofit type site where we can learn more?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will have to reflect on like the resources that I have, and then maybe I can put a comment toward on this dialogue, so people can follow up with some resources.
That's wonderful. I know Dr. Mark Hyman has had great advocacy for this whole regenerative agriculture movement. So he has a book, Food Fix, and he talks about like, what are the things we can be doing on a daily basis? And I feel like this is the call to action, right? Mm-hmm. This is the time more than any other time. And sometimes, I think people get really overwhelmed, they get stressed, and then they feel like, oh my gosh, we live in a system where I don't feel like I have a lot of control. And so doing small things, like I'm noticing even on my social media feed, people starting to get back in the garden, just starting with plants. Maybe you can't control the animal supply. You can start to be more educated. It sounds like we have a lot more development in that area as far as certification and education. And so, but what can we do, right? Locus of control. And so starting to grow like one thing at a time, even starting there.
Absolutely. And, if you live in an urban area and, if all you can do is like have some herbs growing, on a windowsill, that's still, you're still contributing to the food system.
I saw somewhere online about the month of May being the month for bees. And so we should be a little bit more lax about mowing our lawns this month, because this is the time of like, okay, we just had all of the pollen released, and now we've got bees, and we want to ensure a healthy food supply, right? And bees help us to do that. And so maybe it's even like not mowing our lawn to the point of being so tedious and tidy. Maybe we let little patches of dandelions and wildflowers and a lot of these, just more complex arrays of plants start to grow, right? Because that's what I take away from regenerative agriculture. And there was a great documentary. It was, I think it was called A Small Little Farm or something like this. Brilliant documentary about people really just wanting to go back and to create a very, almost just a wilded type of environment, a more regenerative environment where all of the systems are working together. So we just do the best we can, right? With every decision that we make.
Yeah, I would love to actually hear what are some things that have kind of shifted in your life in terms of your approach to nutrition and food systems, and some things that you're seeing where you live in terms of some sort of sustainability practices for the food system.
Gosh, well, first and foremost, as I mentioned, I live in a rural area, and I happen to be tapped into a community-based agriculture system where I can place an order every week. And I think that it's been on the decline for the group because people are afraid. People are afraid to order produce because they feel like it could be contaminated. And so I think that's where we start. I think your comment about that is a really good one, that we have to stay local. We need to support the farmers that we can vouch for. We need to wash our food well. And Dr. Ahmed, as you know, I'm very concerned about the toxicity of the planet. And some people, like Dr. Zach Bush and others, would say that part of the conundrum and the reason how we got ourselves into this pandemic, in part, can be seen through the eyes of toxic people in terms of us having an increased toxic load. The planet is toxic. We've got pollution, air pollution, and that creates a lot of respiratory distress. And so I think as much as we can, everything you said, which was incredible, we shop organic, you make the best choice you can, you wash your food well, even if it is organic, you support your local farmers, know where your food is coming from, and try not to stress about it. I think some people, they can get into this conundrum of like, oh my gosh, it's not pure enough. I think we just do the best we can. We don't want to create stress about the food system either. We can only control what we can.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And I think, two things that kind of concluding thoughts that sort of come to mind is just being mindful as much as we can. And so we don't have so much control, but where we do have our locus of control and within the resources we do have, I think it is, just being mindful in our decisions. I think that just goes a really long way. And it really helps us think about, what our decisions are. And I also wanted to just make a point about local. As much as being local is really, like, we do need to support our local food systems, and it's so critical at this time in helping build the resilience of local food systems. I do want to acknowledge that we do live in a very globalized world, and the way our food systems are currently set up, we can't ignore that we are in a very globalized world. And there's been several scientific studies that have come out recently that if we just focused on our local food systems, we actually wouldn't be able to meet dietary needs for a large percentage of the population. And so some studies show that, let's say, only 1/3 of the planet, if they really followed, let's say, like a 100-mile diet, would actually be able to meet their dietary needs the way our current food systems are set up. And so as much as we do want to support local food systems and begin to build those food systems, there really is this need to start building those systems because, in our globalized worlds right now, everybody eating local is just not possible. And so that's a trajectory we need to really work on. And while we get there, I think it's really critical for countries to really work together at this time. And so as much of a local approach we need to take, we also need to sort of open up our hearts and think very globally as well, and sort of share practices and experiences around the world where different countries may have strengths than other countries do. So I think that's really important at this time too, is being local, but also thinking about the reality we live in, and to make sure we're continuing for countries to continue to have really healthy trade relations to really ensure food supply and global food security.
Words of wisdom. Thank you so much. I mean, I really support the work that you're doing. You are at the nexus, at the forefront of what we really need to be thinking about. And you're doing the research on it. You're teaching students. And I hope that we start to cultivate this type of mindset that you're referring to, so that it's on the mind of everybody, not only the students that you have at Montana State University. It's within each of our minds, because we're eating several times a day. We have that point of purchase at least probably once a week. And so there's so much that we can do as individuals. Dr. Ahmed, thank you so much for addressing with us this very important topic for everyone, and especially for nutrition professionals.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me.
Hello. Thank you. And I'd like to conclude our session today by saying that if you've enjoyed this talk, you will enjoy all of the other talks that we have currently on the website, which is theana.org. You will see all of the expert interviews there. And what I really love about these expert interviews is that we've had the wide array of different people, everybody from researchers to clinicians to biohackers. Now we have Dr. Ahmed talking about food systems. And so the wide breadth, the kaleidoscope of different talks that we can get information from. So again, it's theana.org. And I also want to mention that we are going to be doing a final webinar. So at the end of May, we're concluding these expert interviews. And on Monday, May 25th, we will have our final webinar, and you can find the sign up for that final webinar on the ANA page. You'll see it listed as an event. So thank you again. Wonderful to have you. And thanks, everybody. Stay healthy, stay happy, and Stay within that locus of control. Know that you have the ultimate decision-making power with every choice you have. Thanks, everybody. Take care.